Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome. A source from the Israeli Ministry of Justice said the decision whether or not to try Prime Minister Ariel Sharon of bribery will be made during the next few weeks. Meanwhile, the opposition Labour Party introduced a bill of a no-confidence vote in Sharon's government after an Israeli court accused Israeli businessman David Abil of attempting to bribe Sharon in the 1990s before he took office. At the time, he was holding the office of Foreign Ministry. The investigation report did not state if Sharon had accepted the bribery. Judicial sources also revealed that Abil also tried to bribe the second man in the current Israeli government, Ehud Olmert, who at the time was the mayor of Jerusalem. Abil hired Gilad Sharon, the prime minister's son, as a consultant in a real estate deal to purchase a Greek island. He paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars in return for influencing Sharon. Abil also offered to bribe Sharon in return for helping him in getting development projects in Moshav Janaton near Tel Aviv. Pakistan's police declared that they foiled a terrorist attack after confiscating more than 500 kilograms of materials used for manufacturing homemade explosives. They discovered these materials while raiding an abandoned home in a poor neighborhood in Karachi. Police sources report that they have not arrested any suspects. However, they stated that they received information on the whereabouts of these materials while interrogating a suspect accused of bombing a church in Karachi last week. Following two Israeli air raids targeting Hezbollah locations in southern Lebanon, Israel and the Lebanese party are now leaning towards calming things down, eliminating the possibility of renewed military escalations on the borders, noting that Israeli warplanes shelled Hezbollah targets in the town of Zidkin in southern Lebanon, completely destroying one of the targets and damaging a neighboring school. Welcome to the news from Dhabi TV. In a new political standoff in Iran, Iranian Vice President Mohammad Apathi announced that a number of ministers, deputies, and all members of government, including the Iranian president himself, are willing to submit their resignations in protest of the Guardian Council's decision, rejecting a large number of candidates nominated by the reformists for the upcoming parliamentary elections. Iranian sources report that the ministers will submit their final resignation unless the Guardian Council changes their decision, which prevents half of the nominees from running for office and is causing some parliament members to strike. On another issue, in his State of the Union address, the U.S. President George Bush preferred to talk about the subjects and issues that would keep him in the White House. He also talked about the strength of the U.S., adding that he will not seek permission for waging defense wars. President Bush may have purposely ignored the topics of the peace process and the roadmap. Meanwhile, the Democrats seemed very dissatisfied with Bush's speech.
Many Democratic Congress members were dissatisfied with Bush's State of the Union address. However, his speech did not surprise observers. Bush preferred to talk about some issues over other issues. Nevertheless, his speech was criticized by major American newspapers. According to these newspapers, Bush's policies are not changing, whereas important domestic issues are being ignored. And to their shock, his speech was merely an attempt to stay in the White House. Bush's State of the Union address to Congress, which is predominantly Republican, was closer to a speech that would be given during a presidential election campaign. President Bush began with outlining foreign issues, most important being the issue of terrorism, emphasizing that terrorism remains a threat to the United States and to the world, saying that terrorists are still conspiring against the United States and the civilized world. Bush boasted about his foreign policy, using Libya as an example to justify the war in Iraq, since Libya decided to stop developing weapons of mass destruction. The president clarified that the United States and Britain conducted intensive 9-month negotiations, which were successful, versus 12 years of diplomacy with Iraq, which ultimately failed. It is believed that North Korea and Iran are about to complete their nuclear programs. Thus, Bush insisted that the international community curb the spread of weapons of mass destruction, so they are not in the hands of the most dangerous regimes in the world. Moving from west to east, to Iraq and to its neighbors, in the presence of the current president of the Iraqi Interim Governing Council, Adnan al-Patashi, President Bush stated that the U.S. is continuing with their freedom strategies in the Middle East, adding that they will never ask permission to engage in warfare. Just before ending his speech, Bush turned to domestic issues, saying that the U.S. economy is strong and will be stronger in the future. Meanwhile, Bush asked Congress to increase the budget allocated for democratization and the strategy of freedom and political reform in the Middle East. With these statements, Bush ended his speech, and the Democratic opposition bombarded him with criticism, accusing U.S. President George Bush of isolating the United States and creating a new axis of evil, since his administration has adopted his current policies. Also, those concerned with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict criticized Bush's speech, noting that he ignored the issue, only mentioning Jerusalem as one of the cities rattled by terrorist attacks in recent months.
The United Nations interim force in Lebanon intensified its patrols at the Blue Line after a UN investigation found out that Israel crossed the Blue Line and trespassed the Lebanese territory. Israel, however, made another violation Tuesday when it bombed the southern Lebanese territories, damaging some houses. Washington defended Israel's aggression, labeling it as a response, and called on Syria to cease all support for Hezbollah. Lebanon said that Israel holds full responsibility for any retaliation. The Islamic resistance operation against the Israeli occupation military bulldozer inside the Lebanese territories has sparked a wave of comments in Israel. Israeli analysts have debated about the circumstances of the operation and the role Hezbollah is performing in Lebanon and Palestine. This report has more.
Senior Israeli circles have agreed that yesterday's air raids against South Lebanon is the ultimate response after the Hezbollah targeting an Israeli military bulldozer that violated the Lebanese borders. Israeli political sources said the air raids send a signal for both Hezbollah and Syria, rejecting any change in what it called the rules of game.
The security institution estimates that the current round of strikes between Israel and Hezbollah has ended after the raids against South Lebanon.
I don't think Syria, Hezbollah or Israel are interested in a comprehensive confrontation.
Well-informed Israeli media sources said the timing and place of the raids were picked so they would cause no casualties. The same sources mentioned that the Israeli security institution hasn't taken the decision to attack Syrian targets in Lebanon or Syria, given the fact that this time, if targeted, the Syrians will not stay still. The Israeli sources have admitted that Hezbollah has the initiative and was successful in setting a terror balance formula on the border.
Unfortunately, Hezbollah has changed the power balance to his interest. It's as well as a deterring force against Israel.
The initiative and the deterring power are in Hezbollah hands. Israel has turned to a place where it only makes reactions. Hezbollah functions on an army level with strategic planning, deep analysis, balance of terror and threats.
The Israeli talks in Hezbollah has gone beyond the clashes on the border. The head of the Political and Security Department in the Israeli Defense Ministry, Brigadier Amos Jalad, said, quote, Hezbollah is organizing operations inside Israel and is recruiting Palestinians. In every Palestinian town there is a Hezbollah trained group. He further accused Hezbollah of being responsible for a series of attacks which aimed at spreading security confusion in Israel.
American and Iraqi leaders in Washington played down their chances for general elections in occupied Iraq ahead of the June power transfer, the key demand of Iraq's Muslim Shiite majority. On the ground, 2 Iraqi policemen were killed in Kirkuk and Mosul, and in Baghdad, a U.S. soldier was slightly wounded in a rocket attack in the vicinity of the Rashid Hotel.
Members of the Iraqi Governing Council met with U.S. President George W. Bush and U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell in Washington on Tuesday. Speaking outside the White House after the meeting, Iraqi Governing Council President Adnan Pashidji said that the council was working towards building a legislative assembly representative of the people inside Iraq. Pashidji was joined by Iraqi Foreign Minister Hushayar Zibari and other council members, including Ahmed Chalabi and Abdulaziz Al-Hakim. Al-Hakim argued that demonstrations inside Iraq on Monday and Sunday show that the Iraqi people want elections.
We had excellent talks at the United Nations. We feel that the United Nations has a role to play, and we have asked them to send a team very soon to Iraq to see whether it is feasible to hold elections during the next 4 months.
After meeting with the Iraqi Governing Council members, Powell told reporters outside of the State Department that the U.S. was committed to the 15 November agreement, which set out the terms for restoration of Iraqi sovereignty by the end of June 2004.
And we hope that he will be able to send a team in to consult with the Governing Council, Ayatollah Sistani and others as to how to go forward to implement the 15 November agreement. We all remain committed to the 15 November agreement with the desire and the goal and the deadline we put before ourselves of having an interim government in place by the 30th of June, but recognizing that that is not the end of the process. It is really just sort of halfway into the process of full elections for a democratically elected assembly and a government that comes from that assembly and a constitution that will be ratified by the Iraqi people, and that will take us all the way into 2005.
On the ground, an Iraqi policeman was killed and a city council member narrowly averted death in an assassination bid that left 2 of his bodyguards badly wounded in the explosive northern city of Mosul. Earlier, city council member Salem Haj Isa, charged with security, survived an assassination attempt on Monday when a car pulled up alongside his vehicle and the occupants opened fire. 2 of Isa's bodyguards were seriously wounded in the attack. In Kirkuk, north of Baghdad, a police major was shot dead by guards from a British security firm hired by the U.S. occupation troops to guard oil infrastructure as he was passing a checkpoint. In other incidents, the U.S. Army said it had arrested in recent days 2 senior officers from the army of deposed dictator Saddam Hussein west of Baghdad. In Baghdad, meanwhile, a U.S. soldier was lightly wounded in a rocket attack in the vicinity of the Rashid Hotel.
The 33rd Annual World Economic Forum, WEF, has opened in the Swiss ski resort of Davos, and this year's theme is Security and Prosperity equals Peace. The gathering, attracting more than 2,000 economic and political decision makers, will discuss, among other issues, Iraq's reconstruction and the depreciation of the US dollar. His Majesty King Abdullah will arrive in Davos tomorrow to address the annual gathering, which has drawn heads of states and government officials. King Abdullah will highlight development projects in Jordan at the Economic Forum, being a platform for representatives of Jordanian private sector to meet with world economic leaders and discuss investment opportunities in Jordan. Meanwhile, it was announced that the civil governor of Iraq, Paul Bremer, as well as 6 Iraqi ministers, will not attend the forum to discuss the future of Iraq. The high-profile gathering is convening under heavy security. Switzerland is spending $8 million to avoid disruptions during the forum in Davos, and organizers have said security forces have the situation under control. However, some 200 people staged a sit-in protest at Zurich airport, trying to hamper access to the forum. A police spokesman said a small number of demonstrators had earlier attempted to stop traffic on one of Zurich's main bridges, but left before police arrived. At least 3 U.S. soldiers and several Iraqis were wounded as their patrol ran over an explosive device in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. Iraqi police sources said a Turkish driver was also wounded in the attack, and medics said 2 of the wounded Iraqis sustained serious injuries. Meanwhile, a member of the U.S.-appointed Iraqi Governing Council, Ibrahim al-Jafari, said the Shiites' most revered cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, demanded they consult the United Nations to solve a rift over his call for free elections to choose the transitional government. The United Nations is contemplating sending a mission to Iraq that U.S. and Iraqi leaders hope will clear the way for its June handover of power in Baghdad. UN officials said the technical talks demanded by Secretary General Kofi Annan were ongoing amid widespread speculation by diplomats that the UN chief would authorize a mission soon. The mission would assess the feasibility of national elections before the June 30th handover. Calls for free elections spread to Samawa, where Japanese troops prepare for the eventual deployment of over 1,000 soldiers. About 300 people crowded at Samawa's Central Plaza to rally in support of free elections in Iraq. Only a few kilometers away, Japanese troops were rushing across the town to consult with coalition provisional authority heads in the region. The Japanese are planning to build a base in Samawa for their humanitarian activities. U.S. President George W. Bush vowed guerrillas would not stop a planned handover of power to Iraqis, while Iraq's longer-pressed majority Shiite Muslims demanded a bigger say in their political future. Pressing his case for re-election in November, Bush, in a State of the Union address to the U.S. Congress late yesterday, urged Americans to stick with his leadership on Iraq. Bush said the work of building a new Iraq was hard but right. Bush defended his war on Iraq, saying the world was a safer place since former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was toppled last April. Although no nuclear, chemical or biological arms have been found since Saddam was ousted, Bush said U.S. weapons expert David Kay had identified dozens of programs to produce these weapons. In last year's State of the Union address before U.S.-led forces invaded Iraq, Bush said Saddam possessed chemical and biological arms and was trying to build a nuclear weapon. Bush blamed attacks on U.S.-led forces on a remnant of violent Saddam supporters joined by what he called foreign terrorists.
Since we last met in this chamber, combat forces of the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Poland, and other countries enforced the demands of the United Nations, ended the rule of Saddam Hussein, and the people of Iraq are free. Having broken the Ba'athist regime, we face a remnant of violent Saddam supporters. Men who ran away from our troops in battle are now dispersed and attacked from the shadows. These killers, joined by foreign terrorists, are a serious continuing danger. Yet we're making progress against them. The once all-powerful ruler of Iraq was found in a hole and now sits in a prison cell.
Minutes after President Bush finished his speech, Nancy Pelosi, Democratic Republican in the United States House of Representatives, criticized the State of the Union address and the president's actions in Iraq.
The president led us into the Iraq war on the basis of unproven assertions without evidence. He embraced a radical doctrine of preemptive war, unprecedented in our history, and he failed to build a true international coalition. Therefore, American taxpayers are bearing almost all the cost, a colossal $120 billion and rising. More importantly, American troops are enduring almost all the casualties, tragically 500 killed and thousands more wounded. As a nation, we must show our greatness, not just our strength. America must be a light to the world, not just a missile.
In Davos, British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw left the door open for early elections in Iraq, as a powerful Shiite cleric has demanded. Straw told the World Economic Forum that an election plan agreed with the US-backed Iraqi Governing Council on November 15 would lead to direct elections next year, but indicated changes could be considered. He welcomed UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's decision this week to consider sending a technical team to Iraq to look into the feasibility of early elections. But Straw did not comment directly on a report in Britain's Guardian newspaper that Britain and at least some US officials, including US Civil Administrator of Iraq Paul Bremer, now accept the need for direct elections in Iraq before the June 30th power handover, provided it can be shown that they are practicable.
The discussion which has been stimulated by Ayatollah al-Sistani is whether there can be an element of elections injected into the earlier part of the process. And a large part of that comes down to what you describe as technical issues, but it's essentially what would be the modalities of these elections in circumstances in which there aren't electoral registers and in which the security situation, not across the country, but in certain parts, remains very difficult. Now that's got to be discussed through, and it's one of the reasons why we greatly welcome the forward response of United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan.
Professor Talat Rumeh, the most important and dangerous observations made by a political analyst on the American President's State of the Union speech is that he did not mention the Palestinian-Israeli conflict at all. What about all the promises he made in his previous State of the Union speech, including the promise to speed the process of reaching a political settlement in the Middle East?
This reflects several issues. First, he fears that the two-state solution idea, which he proposed in the past, will fail. The situation on the ground, whether it was caused by the Zionist entity or by the Arabic position, did not allow for the establishment of two states. He did not put enough pressure on the Zionist entity, which led to the construction of the apartheid wall. Now, it is used to annex more land that was occupied after 1967 to lands that were occupied in 1948, and thus creating a situation on the ground that does not allow him to speak about any kind of achievements in the Middle East. Second, he is courting the Arab and Muslim voters in an attempt to regain their votes, especially after the Democratic Party has recently managed to win over Arab and Muslim voters. Third, which is an important and disturbing issue, Bush may decide that until the end of the presidential term, he ought to have Ariel Sharon deal with the Middle East conflict, who then will be able to do anything he wants away from American intervention. The implications of this issue can already be seen in the recent Israeli escalation inside the occupied Palestine or with Hezbollah in the north.
If Bush does that, he will lose Arab and Muslim voters in the United States. However, he did make promises concerning the Palestinian-Israeli conflict without following through. What is your evaluation of this?
I think there is a more dangerous point. The U.S. is losing all of its credibility due to the way it conducts itself in the region. In 1991, a new U.S. strategy was adopted in the Middle East. At the time, the American officials wanted to put the Iraqi war of 1991 behind and focus on the Palestinian dilemma. As a result, the U.S. military operations in Iraq were stopped, and then the Oslo peace process was initiated. Similarly, after the recent invasion of Iraq, which led to its occupation, Tony Blair says, let's put an end to the issue so we can go back to the Palestinian conflict. However, Bush says nothing in his speech about the Middle East conflict, which is dangerous. In fact, when he was talking about the different places in the world where terrorist operations are taking place, he included Jerusalem among these places. This is an indication that the U.S. is still antagonist and opposed to armed resistance operation in Palestine. Thus, the U.S. is losing all its credibility and ability to play its role in the Middle East because it is perceived as completely biased towards Israel.
In 2000, the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States reached 7 million people. Currently, the number is 9 million. About 350,000 new undocumented immigrants arrived in the United States every year. They now comprise more than 3% of the U.S. population. They provide cheap labor and play a major role in the agricultural and industrial economy. The American president is now announcing an important proposal to reform U.S. immigration laws in a way that would give legal status to many undocumented workers.
First, new visa rules were enforced to regulate tourists and visitors' entry into U.S. ports and airports. Now the American president is announcing a new proposal to reform the U.S. immigration procedures. President Bush's plan, which needs to be approved by the Congress, include giving undocumented workers who perform jobs that American citizens do not want to do a temporary and renewable 3 years work visa. He confirmed that the visa can't be renewed endlessly and that he's not considering amnesty for undocumented workers. Some Congress members criticized the plan. Democrats said that it is not enough, while Republicans said that it is too ambitious, saying that the plan, in effect, gives amnesty to undocumented workers.
This new system will be more compassionate. Decent, hard-working people will now be protected by labor laws, with the right to change jobs, earn fair wages, and enjoy the same working conditions that the law requires for American workers.
The temporary visas can become the first step towards acquiring an American citizenship after 5 years of legal status. However, Bush says that the waiting time for obtaining a citizenship will be very long. It is worth mentioning that more than half of the undocumented workers in the U.S. come from Mexico. Many of them die while attempting to cross the hot desert, and some of them die drowning. Officials from the U.S. administration say the plan aims to give undocumented workers an opportunity to get out of the shadows by giving them equal rights to American workers. However, critics say that Bush is trying to win the votes of Hispanic Americans. Democratic advocacy groups representing the Latino community say that Bush's proposal will create a new generation of second-class citizens who will be enticed to work in exchange for untrue promises of citizenships. According to official estimates, about 1.5 million workers enter the U.S. annually. Half of them are undocumented. Whether the U.S. Congress passes Bush's plan or not, observers say it will give him an opportunity to raise the ratio of Hispanic Americans that vote for him from 35% in 2000 to 40% next November, in addition to recruiting many of them in his re-election campaign.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities. and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.